Okay, at the end of the webinar, you'll be receiving a email with a link to our evaluation. So I'll also post that in the chat box for you as well towards the end. So we like to get your feedback. So I'm going to turn it over. Judith is going to be sharing this presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing and let her take over and share.
Okay, does that look good?
Yeah, it looks great.
All right, Sean, go ahead. You get us started.
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting myself, which normally isn't a problem. I want to welcome everybody today to our webinar, Engaging Families and Elevating Expectations, a focus on employment. I'm just going to kick things off here and then hand it over to Judith here in a minute. First of all, I want to thank NTACT for having Judith and I do this webinar. I have a great deal of respect for the work that they're doing around the country around transition, and over the years, NTACT has really played a key role in furthering this discussion about family engagement in a lot of domains. And they've been very open to folks like myself and others who say, you know, we need to do more and have more information around family engagement. NTACT has always been very receptive to that. So thanks to them for giving us this forum. What a great turnout. You know, I've got 156 listed. Which is great around the country if the people want to hear about this. So thank you, everyone. I wanted just to give a quick thank you too to Judith, who's my co-presenter today. She kind of got recruited and she jumped in with both feet. And it's always fun to meet a like-minded soul. So I look forward to having you guys hear what she has to say today. You know, today, in an hour that we have, we really want to just offer some fundamental ideas and some thoughts about engaging families around employment. You know, why may families want to engage or not want to engage? Why is it still a struggle? Why should we do it? Why is it important? We want to give you some concrete strategies as to how you might address this. And highlight, Judith is going to highlight a model for parent training and support that's really focused on employment that she has implemented in the past. And really, most importantly, I think we need to set the stage for future work around this. You know, I've said that I've been thinking about these issues and doing work around this for the better part of 16 years. And I feel like this is emerging from a family advocate issue to an actual workforce and systems capacity issue, which is great because that's where it needs to be. Engaging families in the world of transition and employment is something that's really going to help us do our jobs better, but we need to have some meaningful discussions about what that looks like. So next slide, Judith. So I should say maybe on this slide too that I come from Transcend. I've been at Transcend for a short amount of time. The Transcend is out of Rockville, Maryland, and we do training and technical assistance, research and direct service around transition and employment. Before that, I was at the Pacer Center, and I think I see a couple friends from Pacer in the attendee list, the national, kind of a national advocacy organization around families. So that's where a lot of my expertise comes in. I also represent RRTC on VR practices in youth and a YES Employment Center, which gives technical assistance to the partnerships and employment states. So I do a lot of work around employment. I wanted to let you know kind of where I'm coming from before we get too far into this. I am obviously the guy on the left. The young man in the red t-shirt with me is my brother Andrew. This is a picture of Andrew and I right before going into the XL Energy Center in St. Paul to go see Iron Maiden in concert. We are unashamed heavy metal maniacs, and we go see a lot of shows together. I wanted to show you this because I am at heart a parent advocate. That's where I came from. That's the way that I think. When I attack these types of problems and think about these problems, I really am going to do so through a lens of empathy and compassion, and really trying to promote the fact that we need to work on understanding and look at family engagement as a partnership that can really help us. And so I just wanted you guys to know kind of where a lot of my mindset comes in. And Judith's picture is on the right, and she's going to take it from here for a little bit.
So that's a picture of my son and my husband. We originate from Kansas and recently moved to Indiana University in Bloomington. And so my background is one of both a teacher and a service provider. And I think back to how naive I was as a first-year teacher and my perceptions of families, and how much that has changed over the years. And Sean and I think very much alike in that there's great value in families, and families are the first and last support for individuals, whether you have a disability or not. We all tend to reach out to our families. My family situation is a little different. My husband acquired a brain injury in 2002. And that seriously affected his employment opportunities. We had a business and he lost the business, and where we were living didn't have good medical care, and like a brain injury was just, at the time in that particular state, it just was a thing that happened and you hit your head and it wasn't that big a deal. But so I'm real pleased to see there's a lot more research around that, but I know how much a disability can affect employment prospects and the types of supports that need to be in place from family to encourage that and make that option possible for individuals. So Sean and I wanted to talk a little bit about just our general foundational beliefs about families. He touched on it a bit on the last slide as well. So we're both big proponents of and believe that partnering with families will improve employment outcomes. And that partnering with families should be one of those core things that professionals do, educators, service professionals. Families provide support, they have information. They are a role model for expectations for their family member with a disability. And it is those high expectations that we want, both from families and from service professionals and educators when it comes to employment. And so that's our common ground where we really want to start. And so part of the work that Sean and I have talked about doing is not only do we want to make sure that professionals have the information and the training that they need to engage with families, but families need support as well. Families are going from one system to another, from a school system where everything is right there at their fingertips to an adult service system where it's not. And so they need support in doing that, and all of this collaboration leads to a much better employment outcome. And so why is it still so difficult to engage families then? So part of the problem is that professionals tend to rely a lot on traditional models of family engagement. So this, we're asking questions or we're having them fill out surveys, but we're not actually partnering with them. And there's a difference between just asking for information versus actually being partners. And so thinking about family engagement in a new way is one of our goals. Another thing that's difficult is that families don't really know their role in transition because that is defined by the professional. So often families, when you're in school and your kid's moving from high school to adulthood, how much you are engaged in that process is as much a byproduct of family interest as it is of professional engagement and outreach to that family. So when professionals limit their expectations of families or limit their expectation for family involvement, families tend to be less involved. So, so part of our goal here is that, you know, we want that engagement, and then also just making sure that there's that shared vision for the future. Because if families and professionals don't have their eye on the same prize, it's going to be that much harder to get to that end.
And it's, you know, I've been doing a little reading about the idea of expectations, and when we talk about raising expectations, and that can be a hot button word in education in particular, because it tends to suggest some other conversations that are going on. But really, expectations are assumptions. They are assumptions of a person's ability based on limited information and certain characteristics. And so what we really are talking about here is how do we raise expectations, challenge those assumptions. We know that the family's expectations of what a young person with a disability might achieve are shaped by a lot of things. They're certainly influenced by exposure to role models and positive post-school examples of success, but they're also influenced by the expectations of education and service professionals, as Judith touched on. And one of the things that I talk about often in the presentations that I do is encouraging professionals to really keep in mind about the messaging and the words that they're using for families, especially around employment and post-secondary access and what the impact of a disability might be. And certainly those expectations then influence what a student might expect of themselves. And students too, and we know that students who have had one or more parents participate in IEP meetings in the 11th and 12th grades are more likely to be engaged in post-school employment. So we can kind of point to IEP team participation, meaningful participation on families is something that you can really hone in on. Parents who have had high expectations are more likely to be parents who have had high expectations of their students, those students are more likely to be engaged in post-secondary education and employment. So there is a link there between high expectations and student performance, which is important. And then sometimes, you know, the students do tend to hold higher expectations of themselves than the parents do. What I find, though, is that it's always an individual situation, and you never quite know when you have a family and a student and a service system and all those pieces that come together, who has the high expectations, who maybe needs a little help going along the way. So next slide, please. So we wanted to focus on employment with this particular session, and my time at Transcend, I have been thinking about and being asked about this idea of families who might be apprehensive to explore employment, especially kind of paid competitive employment in the community for their son or daughter. And this conversation tends to revolve around students with more significant types of disabilities. And I think it's important for us to try to empathize with families in those types of situations and put ourselves in those shoes, in their shoes to the greatest extent possible, so we can maybe understand what their reasons might be, rather than just to jump automatically to the families are a barrier to employment. I hear that all the time. The families are a barrier to employment. And there's a lot of different reasons that you might hear. This idea of fear of disruption. I can say, for example, my brother, he's 40 years old, and right now we kind of got everything all where it should be. He's got his job, he's got his apartment where he lives, he's got transportation pretty much locked down, he's got social and recreational activities. We are kind of constantly wary of something that's going to come and disrupt that. And one of the things that tends to come and disrupt that is when the county comes and says, well, we need to redetermine Andrew's status. It's like, well, okay, that is a potential disruption. And I think employment, a lot of families might view employment as a disruption, especially if they are in like a day service or a sheltered work setting. Families of kids with significant disabilities have had connections with systems, county social service, education, so on and so forth, probably throughout their child's life, and there might be some mistrust. I'm not saying it's universal. What I'm saying is that here's some possible reasons for it. There might be some mistrust of the system. There might be some wariness of professionals. One more professional coming into our lives saying this is what needs to happen. Certainly, I hear a lot of concerns over vulnerability and safety, especially transportation-wise and going to work and being at work. And that's an area where I hear a lot of professionals go, well, the parents won't let us try this. And my idea is like, well, let's work with the parent to figure out what the concern is, and maybe we can take little steps to address that. There are a lot of families that just plain old don't believe that their son or daughter can work, that the disability is too impactful, and they just don't see it. It's not that they don't want what's best for their son or daughter, it's just that they don't see it, and they might need some help seeing it. Somebody in the chat box did mention the fear of losing benefits. And that is absolutely the case too. A lot of families either rely on that benefit or, you know, the system is very hard to navigate. And if you throw a wrench into that system, a lot of families are just like, I'm not interested in that. So I give you this list, and it's not a comprehensive list. I give you this list just so we can begin shifting our thinking and saying, you know, there's valid reasons why families might not embrace this. Do me a favor in the chat box as I go on to my next slides. Tell me if there's any other reasons that you have heard or that you believe that families might be a little apprehensive. So what I want to do now is I want to segue into specific strategies that you can use to be able to engage families around employment. Taking a quick drink of water here, somewhat unsuccessfully. So my first strategy is to organize family engagement around existing transition frameworks. A lot of times I hear, Sean, this family engagement idea is really big and I don't know where to start. And so what I would say is there's existing frameworks such as the one on the screen. This is the NTACT Transition Taxonomy for Programming 2.0. It's based off of Paula Kohler's Transition Taxonomy. You might also be familiar with the Guideposts for Success out of the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability for Youth. These are all frameworks that say, here are things that young people with disabilities need to make the transition from school to community. So what I'd like to just suggest is that we've got 5 areas on this taxonomy, family engagement being one of them, but also program structures and collaboration and student development and student-focused planning. You can really focus your family engagement efforts around these frameworks. It gives you a way to say, are we engaging families in these 5 areas in a meaningful way? And the last NTACT Capacity Building Institute in Kansas City, June Gothberg and I did a session on how do you take this framework and kind of insert family engagement into it. And I think that that's the kind of thinking that we need. We need to take existing frameworks and say, how do we turn it so it's usable for us and we use it as a family engagement tool? The next one. So I want to say that we don't have a ton of time here. We have about an hour. So I'm going to kind of run through these things. I'm hoping that the session today gives you some ideas. That's really it. It's not going to be a hand-holding through a bunch of models. It's like, boom, here's some things for us to think about. Another thing that I hear often, or I see a lot in terms of efforts, is this idea of how can we help parents move from low expectations to really seeing the possibilities for employment, right? So how do we move those expectations? And there's a couple of things on this slide that I've seen done. Discovering Family Genius, which was kind of suggested by Catherine Carroll, who's did an ODEP webinar on this topic. The positive personal profile is something that a lot of you may be familiar with in the world of customized employment and discovery. But using tools like that to be able to show families that every young person has a skill And I think Judith is going to get into some of these activities, how they function a little bit more. The Wisconsin Promise Project also had a tool called Positive Picture, which we're going to show here in a second. But what I want to say from the advocate perspective, as we know, changing expectations takes time. It does not happen overnight. It's not going to be that you are going to sit down with the family, show them pictures of other people working, say, hey, your son or daughter can work too, and then boom, everything is fine. It may take time, so you have to be patient with this. This is going to be a big leap for some families to be able to envision this and to really take the risk of trying it out. And so this is kind of where, again, the empathy, compassion piece comes in, but be patient with the process. So this is the Seeing Youth in a Different Way, the Building a Positive Description of Your Child tool that was developed by the Wisconsin Promise Project. And really, all you're trying to do with tools like this is get families to sit down and break the ice of the disability mindset and say, okay, here's what my child is good at. My child is funny. My child is personable. My child is responsible. My brother, for example, yeah, there's a lot of things that he really can't do, but I would say that he is, first of all, he's a fantastic worker. He's built like a brick outhouse. He loves to work. He doesn't miss any work. He does exactly what he's told, and he enjoys being in a work environment. He's funny. He loves things like staff picnics and staff Christmas parties, and he would be a great person in terms of staff employment culture. He loves movies, and he reads books insatiably. There's a lot of things that you can put on a profile like this to help families say, yeah, you know what, my son or daughter's got some skills that we can build on, that we can identify and we can build on. And this is a great thing that you can use in various settings. Another thing, I did some interviews with a bunch of county social workers and employment providers for a webinar that I did for the state of Michigan about half a year ago or so. And one of the interesting things that people brought up was this idea of a family support plan, acknowledging that sometimes competitive employment is very difficult for the family structure, family functioning. Let's say, for example, that you've got a young person or not so young person, and they're in a day program. But what that day program allows the family to do is go to work. The family gets to go to work and earn a paycheck because they know where their son or daughter is going to be. And so if you're going to come into that family structure and say, all right, we want to try paid competitive employment, but the family doesn't see it. They're like, well, what are we going to do for the other hours of the day? We need those days filled, or those hours filled. We need to respect that. We need to say, okay, let's build a support plan so we can help, we can fill in the gaps for the families. We can acknowledge the fears that they have. We can take small steps to negotiate the risks and address the fears that they have, and begin filling in the holes and really answer this key question, which is, what happens if something goes wrong? That's one of the biggest questions families have, okay? We're going to try employment, but tell me what happens if something goes wrong. Is he going to lose everything? No, probably not. But this is part of the plan that might help families feel a little bit better about being able to jump into this idea of paid competitive employment. Okay. I'm a big believer in staff training, and I know that we lately, in the last 5 to 10 years, we have come to accept the fact that there's no money for staff training, that we don't have enough resources to be able to do it the way that we want to do it. But I also think that you cannot expect professionals, educators, transition staff, vocational rehabilitation, whoever, to effectively engage families if they have not been trained to do so. And I don't think there's a lot of pre-service programs that address working with families. I just don't think that there are. There might be some, but I don't think that there are. So we're asking people a lot of times to be able to do something they haven't been trained in. I also think we naturally assume that because somebody gets into a profession like education and they're good working with kids, that that's going to carry over and make them good working with families. And I'm not sure that's the case. It might be, and it might not be. So I just want to say that I strongly believe staff training is a great capacity building strategy to be able to have your staff better engage families. And this needs to begin at the administrative level. If admin does not support this idea of improving family engagement, then all the training in the world is not going to help, because admin is not going to convey that this is really important. And so this needs to get kind of ingrained in any education agency, vocational rehabilitation agency, this idea that we're going to do this. We're going to train ourselves on building relationships. And then also we're going to engage partners to be able to do this. Okay, so there's parent training and information centers. There's great USEDs and on the post-secondary level that can help, like Judith's organization. Don't feel like you have to do this yourself, is all I'm saying. Staff training is great, but engage partners to do so. All right, so lastly for me, a year or so ago, a couple years ago, David Test and the folks at NTAC pulled together a group of parent advocates who are listed there in the author section to put together kind of a beginning document on high expectations. And what we came up with was this promoting high expectations for post-school success by family members, a to-do list for professionals. I wanted to let you know that it's still out there. The URL to access it is on the bottom. And I think it's an admirable attempt to begin lending some structure to what professionals can do to begin addressing this idea of high expectations. And Judith is going to take it from here, and she is going to kind of talk about how some of our ideas and comments align with this, and then she's going to share a program that she's been working on.
Thanks, Sean. So the nice thing about this document is that it has, 7 very specific strategies, and I've listed them here, and just want to talk briefly about, so in Kansas we have a family training program, and so one of the things we do is really try to engage our parents in training opportunities. And in that process we explore role models, we work to build empower families to be problem solvers and self-advocates, and to support their young person's independence. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do some of these things in this program that we've been doing. So we have in Kansas a program called, Family Employment Awareness Training. We actually have it, it's been in Kansas since 2010, and it's been in Rhode Island since 2014. And we're hoping to start it up in a couple more states this year. And so what we did is we built this program because there was a perception at the state level that families just didn't have high enough expectations for employment, that if families had higher expectations, more people would be employed. And expectations are huge. They're very important. If we don't have the expectation that something's going to happen, it's not going to happen, because we're not even going to make the effort to make it happen. So being kind of a how-to girl, I thought, well, I can't tell people they can have jobs if I don't tell them how to make it happen. So not only do we work on the role model piece, showing people that employment is possible and different ways we can do customized and supported employment, but we also work a lot on the benefits piece and the supports piece, and how do you access, what are your local, state, and federal resources? And then how do we access those? And typically we've partnered with the Parent Training Information Center in the state to deliver the training. In Rhode Island, the USED that we partner with also delivers. But with the idea that families want to learn from family members. And we have a lot of research that says that, and the PTIs are a great outreach and source of support for families. So that's one of the reasons why we partner with them. So as I mentioned, we focus on expectations. We kind of have 3 chunks to our training: expectations, knowledge, and support or technical assistance. So again, that expectations piece, we call it building the dream of employment. And so it focuses on the idea that we should have these ideas or these role models that we can look at and see that are successful examples of employment. So we've made this is a cross-disability program. When we first started it, it was for focusing on families with students with significant support needs. And most of our stories and examples that we provided were for individuals with significant support needs. But more people need help. And so we would have families that would come and say, you know, this is great, but I don't see my kid here. I want more stories that look like my kid. And so we tried to really diversify it. And so the expectations piece is built around, we have some good national examples, but we also really focus on what I call localizing the training. So we have stories from across the state in which it's implemented. So when we implement it in Kansas, we have stories that are in rural Kansas and suburban Kansas and in urban Kansas. So that families can't say, oh, that can happen in the city, but that can't happen here, or vice versa. And part of what we do in our formatting is to provide some examples as well. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. The knowledge section is our part 2, and this is the how-to. So we talk about like 26, 28 different supports or services that can be used to help somebody be employed. And I really focus on the ones that are money or information related, right? So, you know, there's a bunch of work incentives, but I only really target the ones that focus on money or, you know, so like how do we use impairment related work expenses, that kind of thing. But we also really try to broaden those ideas of what counts as a resource. What is something I can access in my community? So not just specialized resources where you have to have a disability determination to be eligible, but also those more generic resources, like if you want to start a business, your Small Business Development Center or your SBA Women and Minority Support Centers, or you know, workforce or Career One Stop or Work Ones, whatever it's called in your state. There's a lot more emphasis placed on those since WIOA, but when we started this, they pretty much, you know, would just refer our families straight to disability services. So we try to broaden people's knowledge of what are possible supports and resources out there for the employer as well as the employee, because we know that if we don't have knowledge of how to support that employer as well, people lose their jobs. And so we try to, you know, this training was developed for families, but about 30% of our attendees are professionals, either educators or employment specialists, case managers, along those lines. And it was really important to us that this not be a drive-by training, right? You know, come in, let's fill your brain, overwhelm you, and send you on your way. We didn't really want that. We wanted people to have a chance to think about it and ask questions and have really thoughtful responses to things and feel like things were, you know, their needs were being addressed. So in our format, we have the morning is discussion, small group activities and discussion around those, young adult pull-out sessions where we do some real focused work with the young adults in attendance, and then an afternoon of community members in rotating sessions or panels. So this is part of that localizing the training. So when we go and host this training in, you know, City X, we reach out to the providers in that community to, one, come and talk to families in the afternoon about their services and supports, but also to recommend people that they knew in the community that were employed and successful, and employers that were great employers. And so we reached out to those individuals as well. And in part 1, where we talk about building the dream of employment, our afternoon has families who've started their own business and their young adult comes and talks about their business, or we have individuals who are employed or employers come and talk about what does their job look like? How do they provide supports? What kind of supports do they use on the job? And that afternoon time is really important for helping families to see those role models in their community, to see that it's happening, and to not have that, oh no, you know, we're living in an abyss, right? The idea is to kind of open the doors to their local community and help them see the resources that are there. So in part one, when we talk about building the dream of employment, it's all about the idea that employment is an expectation for everyone and a possibility for everyone. We talk about what employment first policy there is in that state. We discuss those outside the box employment possibilities. So we talk about different types of supported and customized employment, like carved jobs and created jobs and business within a business and self-employment and employer-initiated models as well, such as Project Search or the Walgreens model, or AMC Theaters is another one that we highlight. And so we give all these examples of good opportunities and people and jobs that really match their strengths and their abilities. And then we have this part where we work on the parent and family role in supporting employment, and that's when we do that youth pull-out session. And in part one, we also talk about the transition to adulthood. So what do quality services look like? What should you be considering when the transition to healthcare or post-secondary education training or work? And so that is to help give families a better understanding of what their role is in that process and how they can contribute and support their young adult to become more independent and seek out opportunities in work and post-secondary education that fit their interests. So one of the, I'm going to go back, I missed mentioning one thing. So here I mentioned a couple of things at the bottom of our format here. We have resource packets and a flash drive. So some of the stuff that we provide people is, I believe that don't recreate the wheel. We have so many good centers like NTACT and Transcend and other fabulous centers around the country. So we pulled together on a flash drive folders for every topic that we talk about in family employment awareness training. So if you want to dive deeper into assistive technology, I've got, a 2-page handout from some awesome research and training center in this country that's going to give you the quick and dirty on funding for assistive technology. If you want to know a little bit more about self-employment, there's handouts on there from other well-known organizations across the country. So we've pulled together lots of resources so that families can dig deeper into the sections that are important to them. And then we also provide this individual and group follow-up technical assistance. And to me, that's an important piece that we do to make sure that it doesn't get put on the shelf at the end of the training. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, the group and individual follow-up technical assistance after I talk about part 2. But I didn't want to forget that, because I think that that's really important. When we talk to families, they need to hear it, and then they need to hear it again, and then they're going to need to hear it again and again and again. And so we need to start early, because this stuff is complicated. You start looking when you get out of school and you have to knock on a bunch of different doors to access a bunch of different services. And it's difficult to know where the rules are and what applies. So we want to make sure that we're giving families as much information as we can. And also in like doses, right? So I said we have part 1. We split these up. These are 2 full days of training that we do. So we do part 1, and then we give it a week or 2 to settle and simmer in people's brains, and then we hold part 2. So that gives them a chance to come back with questions and say, okay, so what about this? And also to just really digest all the information, because part 2 is difficult. It's about those resources, and that's where we really it kind of becomes a brain drain for families to try to sort through all that. So some of the stuff we do in part 1, Sean was showing some great activities for families and young adults, and this is just an example of one of the things that we do in FEED. This is like that promise sheet from Wisconsin, where we kind of focus on what are the interests of the family member with a disability, what activities do they prefer, what are some possible employment. We really encourage attendees to collaborate with people nearby in the training, because it's so hard to think of stuff for yourself, real easy to think of ideas for somebody else. So when we pair up families, and I'm a former teacher, so I just start assigning people to talk to other people, because when you talk to other people, it helps to expand your ideas of what's possible. We do similar with the young adults. We identify what are their interests, preferences, and our young adult activities have various levels of engagement. So, we have activities we can do with somebody who's nonverbal, all the way up to, that young man over there who's going to apply for college next year but doesn't know what to do for disability support services. So we kind of cover the range and figure out our best ways to engage the young adults around their ideas for the future. And then part 2, this is the knowledge piece, right? So identifying those resources and how do you access them. So as I mentioned, we talk about 26 different types of resources. So we talk about your common resources like Medicaid and what does that look like in your state. And part of what's really important about this section is it is specific to your state. So often there are those general trainings that give people general information about VR or about Medicaid, but those things can be a little different from state to state. And so when we talk about the resources that are available in your state, we're naming them by name. We're not referencing a general waiver program. We're talking about the waivers that you might be encountering. We're talking about the Medicaid buy-in program by name. We're handing out phone numbers and emails for people, for benefit specialists who serve your area or VR counselors who serve your area. I always get told we have a big uptake on phone calls from people after a training because we're directly connecting people saying, here's the person in this part of the state that you want to talk to. Because I think so often that is difficult for families. If you can't put a face to a name or know what the next question is to ask, it's so hard to just do one of those blind cold calls to try to get information. So also, and you noticed on here I mentioned we address anti-discrimination laws as well. So our young adult pullout section for part 2 focuses on that. So helping young adults to understand disability disclosure, talk about it, think about it, how would you disclose, what are recommended ways to disclose, what are some of those myths that some of our young adults with disabilities might have about employment, like, I have a disability and they can't fire me. You know how many times I've heard that one? They believe because they have a disability, they just simply can't be fired if they were hired in the first place. And so that's a myth that we sometimes have to dispel. It's like, oh yes, you can be fired. Let's talk about how this can happen. And so helping them to understand anti-discrimination laws and how they can support their employment as well as affect their employment. So part of what's really important is I want people to walk away from this training using it with a plan, with next steps. And it's kind of overwhelming. So in part 1, we talk about what are support needs and possible job ideas. Well, in part 2, one of our activities is to take those support needs and match them to a resource that we've already discussed. So we talk about 26 different resources. Well, maybe the family realized that the transition goal that they have on their IEP is not fabulous. And they would like a more fabulous employment goal with, integrated competitive employment outcomes. Well, that is a support need, and maybe their resource is the PTI staff member who can help them work through some of those advocacy issues and prepare for that transition meeting. A support need may be realizing that it's time to connect with VR, and so the resource may be that counselor who came to talk in the afternoon and taking that application that they were handed and acting on it and connecting back with that counselor. So we just try to have them pull 5 support needs that you have and match it to a resource that you learned about. So they can see how to apply the knowledge that they've just acquired. And for our young adults with disabilities, this goes back to that advocacy and disability disclosure. So we talk about what are those advantages or disadvantages and ways in which you might go about doing it. And then the final follow-up here is, again, I don't want it to go on the shelf. So I said we do technical assistance, right? So at the end of the training, there's a chance for them to request individual technical assistance. We have one of those little NCR tear-off sheet papers for their plan that's shown here. And because some families, they're kind of like, they become overwhelmed. Like, oh no, I missed this opportunity, or we transitioned out of school and we didn't get a job. Like, where am I on the timeline of things to do, right? And I tell them that, you are where you are. And so start where you are and figure out what is a next step to move you forward. Just because maybe you feel like you missed some opportunity, it doesn't have to stop your train from rolling on to employment. So we have them identify their 5 next steps, and then a resource they're going to use to accomplish that step. So it could be related to those supports before. Well, actually, the examples I gave before were more related to this. So, that could be related to the supports their young adult might have. Like maybe they have job learning skill needs, and so they're going to need a job coach. Well, your next step here might be to contact whatever local agency it was that you heard come and talk, and that seemed like they, had a good employment philosophy, and maybe you want to contact them and see about getting some of their services. And so we have families just identify 5 next steps so they have a plan to accomplish. They set themselves a date, a goal, and they have an opportunity to ask for follow-up from the Parent Training and Information Center. And they can provide their contact information. And then within a month or 2, depending on when their anticipated due date is, the Parent Training and Information Center specialist will give them a call and say, hey, just wanted to follow up, see how you're doing. How's your plan going? Did you encounter any barriers that we can help you, get past? So there's that individual piece, right? And then we realized when we did some research that not everybody who needs help asks, right? Like there's a lot of people who need help who simply just don't ask. But if we invited them, they'd come. So we partnered really closely with our workforce development centers in Kansas and scheduled group technical assistance at 3 months and 9 months following a training, and invited anybody who had attended the training to come to their local workforce center so we could, 1, introduce them to a resource they might not have been introduced to yet because it wasn't a disability-specific resource. And then we told them, bring your plan, bring your IEP, bring your IPE, bring your transition problems. And we had a parent training specialist, myself, and workforce staff there. Families got introduced to this new resource, learned what was available, and between the 3 of us, we were able to figure out who was the best person to help them move on to their next step. And so with those 2 forms of technical assistance, we built capacity with our workforce centers and serving people with disabilities. And we provided opportunities for families and service providers, professionals. We've had educators and service providers take advantage of the technical assistance as well. So I think that's been one way that we've been able to keep it on people's radar. And our research that we did recently on our trainings from 2013 to 2016 showed that over 50% of people who attended FEAT trainings were still using the materials at least once a month, if not more frequently, a year later. So that's really good. That means it's not going on the shelf, and this is a valuable resource that people are using. So it can be adapted for any state, and it really helps families to kind of understand what that system is when they leave school. Sean?
Well, thank you, Judith. That was great. And there's a lot of, I don't know if you're watching the chat box, Judith, but there's just a ton of stuff firing back and forth. So you guys, thank you for participating, everybody in the chat box, and kind of, we have a sub training going on in the bottom, and that's a lot of fun because there's a lot of momentum here. I love the framework that Judith is talking about, because I know that some of the conversations we were having at Pacer before I left to go to Transcend was, we need to get beyond just throwing information out into the world. We really need to find a way to support families through the process. And that seems to be the basis for a lot of conversations moving forward in supporting families. As I hear a lot from around the country, Sean, we have plenty of resources. It's not, resource development is not generally the issue. The issue is something else. We're not quite getting at the best way to support families. So this, the FEAT training seems to be a great way to do it. A couple of thoughts that popped into my head. Certainly, when we think about engaging families, we cannot think about it as a one-time shot. A lot of times things will get funded and say, well, we did 5 parent trainings around the state of Minnesota 5 years ago. Why do you want to do it again? Well, okay. Do I have to list the reasons? But so this is family engagement is an ongoing concern. It's something that is constantly needs to be worked on. And as Judith said, everybody needs to hear things multiple times before they really get it. It's the same with families of people with disabilities. And I have come to believe that working with families is as individual of a pursuit as working with students. So individualized services for students with disabilities is kind of the cornerstone of how we deliver special education. We can't always look at serving families in chunks. We have to sometimes say, you know, if you worked with one family, you've worked with one family. And we need to get better at looking at families as individuals and how do we help them with their individual concerns and strengths and needs, and not just, okay, we did a handout, everything should be good. So a couple of things that just, I think it was great information and wonderful program. Summary of our recommendations that we've talked about here. You know, if you have any questions, first of all, throw them in the Q&A box while I'm going over this last section, and we'll see if we can't get to a couple. But we talked about organizing around existing frameworks. If you're having trouble figuring out where to get started in your agency around family engagement, really see this as a staff capacity issue. If you have staff that are working with young people, then you need to have staff who have some skill in engaging families. Because no longer is it acceptable for us to say, I work with kids, I don't work with families. And that's kind of an old school way of thinking that we just can't really have in our service systems anymore. We need to strive to understand where families are coming from. I'm not saying they're always going to be right. But what I'm saying, before we blame, we need to try to strive to understand. There's a lot of tools. There's tools out there that I shared. There's tools out there that Judith shared to help families kind of recalibrate the way that they see employment for their son or daughters. Really continuously providing families with usable, up-to-date information in multiple ways. It has to be an ongoing concern. It's not a one-time thing. Next slide, please. And some resources that we have. Real quickly, if you want to know where your parent center is in your state, go to parentcenterhub.org. They also have kind of a clearinghouse of resources from the parent training centers around the country. Pacer Center's got a wonderful National Parent Center on Transition and Employment. They've got great stuff. Yes to Employment is the Technical Assistance Center for PI states, but they got information for self-advocates and families. That's the Promise Wisconsin website, where I tend to steal a lot of things. So thank you, Ellie, and everybody there at the Promise Project. Charting the Life course is another kind of popular set of tools and materials out of the University of Missouri, Kansas City. That's the lifecoursetools.com. And of course, Judith and the family awareness training that we have. I see 2 questions in the Q&A box. Should I jump in, or is Jackie on? I think I'll jump in. Okay, well, here we go. We are wondering.
Go ahead and jump in.
Okay. You're going to jump in?
No, you.
Oh, great. I'm jumping. We are wondering what you would recommend for service professionals who experience working with families who are overly involved. Okay, and that is going to happen. As I said, I think that you could almost turn what we said and turn it around to that same thing. A family that's apprehensive about it, you can get to the root cause. A family that's overly involved, you could also get to the root cause. Now, being a family advocate for as many years as I was, I'm a firm believer that yes, there are families that are too involved. And yes, there are some families that really cause a hindrance to the process as they are currently functioning. I don't think there's any problem with sitting a family down and going, we need to come to some kind of understanding as to how you and I are going to work together. Because we need to work together to ensure the success of your son or daughter. Always put the son or daughter in the middle of it, though. Judith, do you have any thoughts on that? Because that's a question that we get a lot.
Yeah, so I think that, parents who are overly involved actually often come from the same place as parents who are apprehensive, right? So one of the things that I think is so hard for us to remember as professionals is that parents have this whole, especially once they get to employment, they have this whole lifetime of experience with professionals in their lives, and they've not all been good experiences. And so that overly involved part is often trying to prevent something that has happened in the past. You know, they're, at least in my experience with families, is that they come with a lot of service provider baggage, right? And so sometimes it's a matter of just sort of talking with the family, kind of trying to understand what they see as their role in supporting that individual, and how, and then providing them with some ideas of how they can best focus their energies to support their family member.
I think that is the end of what we had for questions. Anyway, we're at 2:59. Judith, do you have any parting words before we go?
I don't. You know, if you want any more information, feel free to email either of us. We're happy to share resources and chat with you further if you want, and we'll cruise through these questions and see if there's any others that are in there that we can address maybe after the webinar. I just was looking at the chat real briefly. There are lots of really cool resources in there. So I hope that can be printed up and saved with the webinar as well. I don't know if it can, but that would be cool.
Well, I just want to say thanks to everybody too. Listen, it's going to take all of us to elevate this conversation of family involvement. It can't just be a small group. Our group is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. People are starting to see the value of it. And so thank you for attending, and thank you again, NTAC, for having us. It was a good opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
You bet. You guys were awesome. And regarding the questions, I just copied them off, Judith. So we'll see how we can get some of that stuff in a document and post it along with the webinar. So again, you'll be receiving an evaluation email link, and we really value your response back to that. So please do answer, and I just appreciate you guys being on and sticking with us. Good information. Thank you.